Okay, so worming and anthelmintic resistance. I'm going to try and make this as interesting as possible, as challenging as possible. First of all, I have a vested interest. I breed horses, I race horses. We've had Ausbred King, Ausbred Blue. Currently have Global Ausbred, Ausbred Flirt, etc. So the Ausbreds, that's all my fault. The whole thing of anthelmintic resistance is worldwide. It's a global problem. It's a problem in Australia. It's a problem that doesn't seem to be recognised by a lot of people. I'd have to say I think most studs don't understand that they've got a resistance problem, and I'm going to show you exactly what that's all about. And there are no new anthelmintics being developed. So the last of the mectins, probably moxidectin, came around 2000. Since then we've had doramectin and one other, but they were all in sort of 2000. There's really nothing in the horse. There's nothing coming through. So there's no likelihood of anything happening. And I'm here as a manufacturer of wormers to tell you to use less wormers and do more fecal egg counts, okay, and fecal egg reduction tests. I want you to buy less wormers, not only from me, but from everybody else. Now, I don't know anybody in the country that would say that to you, but that's the situation. Things have got that bad. The sheep industry is a great example of what not to do. So if you go to Armidale in November with lambs, they will be worming every 3 weeks. Now, if we want it to continue the way we are, it's going to happen. It's exactly the same thing's going to happen in the horse industry. And we'll see losses of foals, and we'll see losses by other means, such as ascarids, etc. So, when we look at pasture, we have about 5% actually in the animal. 5% of the worms are in the animal. The rest of it is down there on pasture. So what we do is we worm every 6 or 8 weeks and we turn them back onto the same pasture. A lot of the farms, and quite rightly so, are trying to maximise what they're doing. They're commercial operations and they should be profitable. But the whole thing is there's probably not enough land out there in the first place. So there's not enough room to be able to rotate with other species of animals or to leave areas that, you know, for 3 or 6 months and not have animals grazing on them at all. Once we get to dry pastures, it sort of reverses. So when you get down so that it's like this in a drought, you have a lot more worm eggs at the larval stage in the animal. Obviously, because there's a lot less grass, they've eaten it all. So it's got to go somewhere and it's ingested. Okay, so when we look at pasture length, and probably most of you haven't seen these sort of slides before because they haven't been presented, but the most effective worm larvae are in the first 5 centimetres, so sort of in here. Then there's less here, and then by the time you get to 15 centimetres, there's virtually no worms at all. So pasture length is really important. Survival of parasitic larvae, so that's worms. 0 to 30%, they can survive anywhere from weeks to months. When it's over 40 degrees, such as we get those summer days, we get 10 days in a row, that pretty much knocks off all the larvae. And then you have repeated thaw cycles are detrimental, but they still survive, as you'll see. And some of these eggs can survive years, months and years. Okay, Anne Beasley, 2020, surveyed 102 farms. Every farm had small strongyles. Ascarids were prevalent in horses up to 2 years of age, 34%. On all farms, it was 14.7%. Large strongyles, well, even when we've done trials, we've struggled to find large strongyles. I mean, you can get them out of libraries and things like that, or people that keep cultures, but you can't, trying to find them is very difficult. And then the one thing we continue to do is tapeworm. I mean, I know studs in the hunter that for 5 years have used a wormer and praziquantel every 6 or 8 weeks. This is what small strongyles look like. They're the most important and common parasitic nematodes of horses. They're found on all horse properties. The adults are 10 to 20 millimetres long. Clinical signs include poor performance, dull coat, recurring colic, diarrhoea, weight loss, and severe cases death. Now, I would defy anyone, and I've done this a number of times, you can pick out the odd horse that is obviously wormy. But there's a lot of very shiny, fat horses that are also very wormy. And there's a lot of skinny horses that aren't wormy. So recently in a stable horses, we did about 20 fecal egg counts. And the interesting thing was, everyone was trying to guess which ones were wormy. There was only 2 out of the 20 that were really wormy, and they came from the same stud. So it's very, very difficult to tell by looking at them. The third stage, the L3s, they insist and they burrow into the mucosa and submucosa, and they can remain dormant for up to 3 years. And transmission occurs on pasture. Ascarids, big problem, particularly in foals. I've been on studs during a drought and people say, oh, it's the dust that's affecting them. Well, it could be dust, but 9 times out of 10, it's not dust at all, it's ascarids that's causing the coughing. So they're a large parasite that measure up to about 50 centimetres. They can cause depression, respiratory disease, reduced weight gain, diarrhoea, constipation, colic and death. Now, if they're going to migrate into the lungs, they're not going to be racehorses. All right, it's like trying to say you're going to race a horse with asthma, or if you're trying to run yourself and you've got asthma. The adult parasite is found in the small intestine. It undergoes a direct life cycle and the eggs can survive several years on pasture. Natural immunity develops at about 18 months of age. And that's the one thing about foals, that they do develop immunity. And immunity is a really important thing to consider before you worm any of them. Okay, classes of compounds. So we've got 4 classes of 4 broad spectrum, and then we've got this group here called the isoquinones. So the macrocyclic lactones, the mectins as we refer to, and to give you a horse analogy, so we've got abamectin was the first one, ivermectin was the second one, and moxidectin was the third one. That's like talking about invincible spirit, I'm invincible, and what's your son, hellbent. Okay, they're all related. Okay, so if you get resistance to the first one, the chances are you'll get resistance to the second, third. There are examples on farms where they had not used any ivermectin and they had resistance. We had an issue recently with a cow who had antibiotic resistance. She's had, I think, either 2 calves. She's never been off the property. Where the hell did she pick that up? She hasn't been treated with anything. So it's just out there. So the important thing is that the first 4 groups, the macrocyclic lactones, the BZs, the tetrahydropyrimidines and the heterocyclic, are all broad spectrum. So they all do small strongyles, large strongyles and ascarids. This group here only does tapeworm. And these 2 do apifoliata, which is one type of tapeworm. This does the 3. This gets done to death. Praziquantel. Ben, if you'd like to hand out a few wormers. So what I want you to do is just have a look at these wormers. There's a mixture of wormers, some of them are ours, some of them are other companies. The main thing I want you to look at is, I'm not interested in the name. Do not be interested in how pretty the package looks. Right, just grab one and pass them along. Just hand them out, Ben, please. But just look at the types of wormers. So really we've got only a few combinations that we can use. So there's a number of single active wormers, ivermectin, fenbendazole and oxfendazole. And then we have these dual actives. Now the first 3 there are really not dual actives. I mean, yes, there's 2, but praziquantel only does tapeworm, so you're still relying on the 3 mectins. These ones down here, abamectin, marantal, piperazine, oxfendazole, marantal, they are dual actives. They have, and one of the things we've found is, in the States, for example, they basically can only register 1 active. So when you put 2 actives together that work in concert, you get a synergistic effect. In other words, they work better than either one on their own. These triple actives, that just tells us we're in trouble. There's a product out there at the moment that's used in sheep, cattle and goats that has 4 actives. And there's a paper written by Jane Lamb which states that it actually promotes worms. So we've got some issues. So just remember, praziquantel is tapeworm only. You don't need to use it 6 or 8 times a year. You probably need to use it once or twice. Once in spring and maybe in autumn if it's particularly wet. But you don't need to use it 6 or 8 times a year, which is really what happens now. Resistance. Resistance can be defined as the ability of parasites to survive a prescribed dose of the anthelmintic that would normally be susceptible. Now, an effective wormer, so if I have to register a wormer with the APVMA, I have to prove efficacy at 95%. That's getting harder and harder to do. A lot of the products that are out there now are what we call Me Too. So they're exactly the same, 2 actives together or 1 active or 3 actives, repeated over and over again with different brand names. So what I want you to do the next time you feel that you've got to go and get some wormers, go and look at them, consider rotating wormers, etc., and I'll talk about that. The one thing that's important for you to understand is resistance cannot be reversed. We've got resistance, it's here to stay, we have to manage it. The way to manage it is to use less chemical. That's the way to do it. But you've got to do other things. You've got to work it through your management to get to that result. There is resistance to the BZ, so that's things like oxfendazole, fenbendazole, oxybendazole, macrocyclic lactones, abamectin, moxidectin and ivermectin, tetrapyrimidines, and they're all documented as having issues of small strongyles and ascarids on farms. There will be resistance on your farm. You mightn't know it, you mightn't have even considered it before. Okay, so resistance for small strongyles. This is the latest result. So Jabbar, Abdel Jabbar, Melbourne University, 2021. Ivermectin was first seen in 2008, so that's 14 years ago. Moxidectin and praziquantel has in 2021, and then these older products like fenbendazole, oxybendazole, oxfendazole, which all came in the 60s and 70s, from 1994 through to 2002, 2021. Oxfendazole and pyrantel is the first evidence of multi-drug resistance. Okay, so, and then marantel. To ascarids, anybody using amectin against ascarids, forget it, just doesn't work. So you've got to go to a BZ combination. Okay, so you've got to use oxfendazole and piperazine, oxfendazole and pyrantel, something like that to make it work. Fecal egg kits, we've got 2 of them here, just going to pass one each side of the room. Don't know if you've seen them. Okay, so 4 terms. Fecal egg count reduction test. So we do a fecal egg count, we make a decision as to whether we need to worm these foals, and then we do a second test 2 weeks later to see whether our worming has in fact worked. Okay, fecal larval cultures, this involves the incubation of a sample, allowing the eggs to hatch and then counting and identifying the larval species. You'll always get at least 3 or 4 larval species in every egg count that you do. I mean, all we do is do a count, you might come up with a number like 500. We don't necessarily do the speciation to work out which ones are there. And then the egg reappearance period, that's defined as the time between the last effective anthelmintic and the resumption of significant strongyle shedding. Now, so, I missed one, no, right. So fecal egg counting, there's only 2.6% of that 102 studs that does fecal egg counts. Now I know there are some studs in the room that do fecal egg counts and do a lot of them, but there's a lot of you do absolutely nothing. Okay? and we need to do something about it. So you've got some options. You've got your on-farm vet, if you've got a vet on farm. You've got your local veterinary clinic. You can go to service providers like GYST at Armidale. Get your shit together, that's what it stands for. EMAI, Elizabeth MacArthur Agricultural Institute, or the University of Melbourne. We've used the FECPAC 2, about $8.80 a test, thereabouts, $8 a test, so it's very cheap. It's a bit laborious though, it takes time. The parasite is relatively new. It's very good. Martin Nielsen designed it, or was one of the co-designers of it. It's very good, it's very quick, it's very efficient, but the cost of it is about $26 a fecal egg count. I just think it's probably a little bit high, but doing egg counts is better than squeezing another tube of paste down their throats. So, okay, so when to treat? If you have a number between, and you've done a fecal egg count, you get a number between 0 and 300, do not treat the horse, do not treat the weanling, the yearling, whatever it is, please, do not treat it. If you get a count between 300 and 500, you treat with a suitable wormer, and you do a fecal, so the first one you do a fecal egg count next rotation. With the, at the medium, you treat and then test again, and preferably 2 weeks later, I think you should do a fecal egg count reduction test. Because that'll tell you whether the wormer worked or not. Now, if you get counts of 50, for example, and 0, they're fine, leave them. High counts of 500 plus, and if you get 1 ascarid, you need to treat. Ascarids are nasty. So I've seen several scenarios. We get 10 weanlings in a group. We get 2 in the group that's got, say, 50 or 100. We get 6 in a group, in that same group, that's got, say, 200. And we get 2 in the group at the other end that have got 500 plus. Treat the 500 plus. You don't need to do the other 8. Don't treat the other 8. Let them go. Let them develop their immunity. That's what it's all about. Let them tell you. Okay? The chances are those 2 with the 500 egg count plus are actually infecting the other foals anyway, or yearlings, whatever they are. Ascarids is a problem, and ascarids you really need to be on the ball and keeping an eye out for them. Coughing foals is usually a bit of a, it suggests that you've got a problem. And we're looking for a minimum fecal egg count of 1 per season, 1 every 3 months, 4 times a year. Okay? Now, if you've got a lot of horses, that's going to be difficult to do. So what I suggest you do is you take your first 10, and then in a month's time you take another 10, etc. And just, or every 6 weeks, if that's the way, or when you bring them in to have their feet trimmed, right? Pick out the ones and do fecal egg counts and find out what you've got. Managing strategy. These are suggestions, but some of them aren't terribly practical. But anyway, remove manure from the stables, yards or paddocks where you can. Spell paddocks, especially in summer. Cross graze with cattle or sheep. Dose and quarantine animals for 48 hours prior to introduction to the herd, perhaps even longer than that. If you're talking about a homunculus contortus in goats or sheep, or even you probably, homunculus can last for 56 days. So quarantining an animal for 56 days is a long time. But it's just one way of when those introduced animals come in, they deposit it in that yard, you get to collect it from that yard, worm them at that time and get them out of the place. Do not rely exclusively on any one class of compound. If you're going to use ivermectin and praziquantel, you're just going to create a bigger and bigger problem. Do not rely on paddocks to be annual weanling and yearling paddocks. We find this quite a lot. Oh, well, we've got weanling and yearling fencing over there, but that's not. And then these other yards, or paddocks, are broodmare paddocks. Just try and have a think about what you can do there. Rotate paddocks with older stock, example broodmare stocks. Refugia, which I haven't sort of talked about, but again, that's really where you're talking about treating only those ones that need to be treated and don't allow the others, but that's a whole subject on its own. Allow the weanlings and the yearlings to develop their own immunity. Biowormer. Biowormer is a biological control. It was discovered by CSIRO. They found Duddingtonia flagrans on pasture in the mid-1990s. We worked with CSIRO from 1997 to 2004. We commercialised this product in 2018. It's currently sold in Australia, New Zealand and the US. And we're completing 3 extra trials we've completed for submission into the EU. It targets as the most it's a fungus that you feed to the animal. It does absolutely nothing to the animal at all. But when it gets into the manure, which is where the parasite larvae are, once they hatch, it sporulates and it captures them. Creates a noose, has a hyphal web, it captures them and consumes them within the manure, and that breaks the cycle. That doesn't allow them to get back onto pasture. And this is what we need to do. So the most susceptible are young animals from 3 months to 18 or 24 months of age, and of course periparturient females during the last month of pregnancy and while they're producing milk. They naturally have a drop in immunity. So if you look at the trials we've done, we've had counts of 2,248. In the biowormer group, there's 363. That's capturing a lot of larval pasture. It's reducing them by 84%. With goats are a great example because goats never develop immunity. So we've got goats now that have been on biowormer for probably 2 years and they're getting 0 egg counts. They're not worming at all. I bet there's not a stud in the room that can say that. But I'm hoping in the next couple of years you'll be coming back to me and you'll be saying we are doing that and we are seeing that. It's got to change, as simple as that. It just has to change. So the message, the take-home message, go back to your studs and tell them, hey, what are we doing in this area? Some of you are doing a really good job now, and some of you really need to look at what you're doing and really make an effort. For the vets in the room, sorry Kevin, but vets got out of worming a long time ago. Vets got out of worming because you could go down to the produce store and buy a wormer. Now Kevin, when he was worming, he would have been doing what, 100 a day? Easily. I think we had this conversation once before. Ian Duckworth said I used to do 100 and Kevin said he was lazy. He used to do 120, 140. 400 a day. So there you are. The difference now too, in the US there's only single actives. In Europe and recently in the UK they've gone to prescription only for wormers. In other words, you can't buy a wormer unless you go to your vet. In Switzerland, if you want to worm an animal, you have to take the faeces to the vet analyses it, and he gives you exactly the number of wormers for the number of animals that you've got on your farm or stud. This indiscriminate use of wormers has to stop. And I'm telling you as a manufacturer of wormers, so it must be serious. Okay? I love these did you knows. High shedding 450 kilo horse with a fecal egg count of 500 eggs plus a day is capable of contaminating the pasture with over 200 million eggs in 1 month. That's a lot. Okay, this is a stud program designed by a vet. This is what you need to go home and do. Think about what you're doing. There's no right or wrong with this. This is simply, it's a plan, okay? So what we've got here is we've got the age of the animals. We've got the drench that we intend to use. Before we do any drenching, we're going to do a fecal egg count. And then at 26 weeks, we're not only going to do a fecal egg count, but we're going to do, 2 weeks later, we're going to find out how well that last worming did. And you can do that on any of them. And then we do the fecal egg count reduction test 2 weeks immediately after worming. So with the wormer paste, we're going to do it after 2 weeks, and with the elevation, we're going to do it 2 weeks afterwards. We want to know how well that actually did. We also want to identify foals or yearlings that are more susceptible to worms than others. Some you'll find are bulletproof, and some you'll find are a real problem. I mean, I've seen, we ran a trial years ago with McWormer and Bott. We had 2 groups of 7. We found one group in each that had 2,000 eggs per gram. We wormed it a second time, both of them a second time. We ended up taking them out because they still had 1,500 eggs per gram. So they're what you call high shedders. They're the sort of horses you would cull. Now, if that's $1 million broodmare, that's not going to happen. But that's just the fact of life. So this is a good plan because it's got the fecal egg counts, it treats them as appropriate, and it has the monitoring. We have a complete worming guide. So you can follow this. So we have a suggested worming program, a minimum of 1 fecal egg count per season. We're assuming that everyone's in the practice of doing 2, but hopefully less. And then we're also advocating the use of biowormer or Livamol with biowormer for about 60 days. When 0 to 3, I'll just repeat this because I want to make sure we get this through. So 0 to 300 is low, so we're not going to worm them at all. 300 to 500 we're going to treat with a chemical wormer and do fecal egg count the next season. 500 plus we're going to do a chemical wormer and also treat next season. Ascarids, for goodness sake, keep an eye on the ascarids because they're becoming worse and worse. All right, and if you want a hand doing these, I'm more than happy to do it. I don't care whose product you use. I don't care which manufacturer you use, right? I just want to see you get it right. That's the most important thing. So summary, evidence-based worming, that's what we want. Consult your veterinarian about worming. Vets, please re-engage. Only treat moderate and high shedders. A minimum of 1 fecal egg count per season. Consider the fecal egg count reduction test, so 2 weeks after you've used your effective wormer. Anthelmintic resistance is likely to be an issue on your farm. There are no new anthelmintics being developed, and use biowormer strategically when conditions are conducive to larval development transmission on pasture. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. That's what we're doing at the moment. Any questions?
What do you think about using natural things such as apple cider vinegar and psyllium husk?
When you provide the science, I'll accept it. Until it happens, forget it. Yeah. There's got to be science. If you're going to use those things, show us the science. It's pretty simple.
What would you do if you've got a high shedder and you do your fecal egg count reduction test 2 weeks later and it's still above the 300?
You're probably going to have to look at worming that horse, but I'd probably isolate that animal.
Yep.
I'm going to assume it's only one that you've got like that. You do get these high shedders. You will get high shedders. We've seen them a number of times, and they're an absolute problem, particularly if you're in a group situation, because they will contaminate the other foals or lambs or kids, whatever they are, calves. They will contaminate. They're the problems. The fact that you're doing fecal egg counts will allow you to identify those ones that are a problem, all right, and concentrate on finding a solution for them.
What's your view on what might be the old wives' tale that if you spread the lumps of the poo into small bits, that helps break up the worm?
Well, plenty of people either vacuum or they run a set of harrows across. You've still got to rest the pasture. It's good on you know, if on sunny days where it dehydrates quickly. But a lot of people try to collect it and put it into piles and allow it to mature that way, remove the problem.
Why are horses or animals high shredders? Like, why do they know why they are?
No.
Is there any factors?
I don't. It's a bit like saying how many people in this room are asthmatics, or how many people have got whatever disease you can think of. It's the same thing. Some of us are more susceptible to these things than others, and the same thing happens in animals.
How are you going to try and educate the sort of, say, the local produce store that you can just go in and buy whatever you want?
I'll let Ben answer that. It's impossible because the trouble is their staff change so regularly, etc. Most of them don't know anything about it. I mean, basically, it's a bit like walking into McDonald's. You go in and you ask for a chicken burger, they'll ask you about fries. That's about it, right? Most of them haven't got any idea. But we are trying. It's hard work, though.
Is there any development on killing it when it's in the larva stage, while on the grass?
You can't kill them while they're on the grass. The only way you can kill them is by feeding something like biowormer, the Duddingtonia flagrans, which consumes them in the manure, and it'll keep consuming them until they're gone. It then dies off in the manure, and they don't escape onto grass. So, and if you think back on that first slide, only 5% of them in the horse, the rest of them on the pasture. So every time you worm them and put them back onto pasture, they're just going to get worms again. So you've got to get the numbers down. They've got to be rested, cross-grazing, whatever. You can't, it's not as though you could take a whole lot of Duddingtonia or anything else for that matter and spray the pasture. It just doesn't work like that.
Would it be worthwhile having, say, like a worming area, and when it's time to worm them, just put them in there, not have them in there in their normal paddocks?
You can do
So
that.
it all gets dealt with there, and then, once that's done, you put them back in their normal paddocks?
Well, the biggest problem is putting them back in the normal paddock. That is the biggest mistake everybody makes.
But if you left them so there for, say, a couple of weeks or something, and then put
Well, if you bring them in, you bring them all in, and look, it's a lot easier to do with cattle and sheep. You bring them in, you worm them, you hold them there for 24 hours, and then you take them out onto fresh pasture. That's really what you need to do. This concept of putting them back into the paddock, all you're doing is putting them back, and 90% of the parasites are on that pasture again, and then you have to do the same thing in 6 weeks' time, or 8 weeks' time, or 3 months' time, whatever it happens to be. That's the problem, is people take horse out of this paddock here, they worm it here, and they take it back and put it back in that paddock. That's the problem. And a lot of the studs are probably maxed out as far as horse numbers, so they don't have spare paddocks or capacity. Very difficult. They're running commercial enterprise. I get it. Don't worry. I understand why they're doing it. I've been in the same boat. I mean, having said that, we have a small acreage. We have 30 acres and we have 8 cows, I think, on it. And I don't think we've wormed in the last 3 years. And we've done plenty of fecal egg counts. But we tend to strip graze with them. All right, New Zealand is good at that too. They do a lot of strip grazing. And that really makes a difference. So shorten up that paddock and let them graze it for 24, 48 hours, and then move them onto a fresh lot of pasture. Bit of work, but it does work. Is that it? Anybody else? I'll be around if you want to have a chat.